Welcome to the Morrison Report. Hosted by Deval Morrison, sales representative for Bosley Real Estate Limited Brokerage. Ms. Morrison has co-authored the best-selling book, Success Today, with Brian Tracy, and has been interviewed on NBC, ABC, and CBS affiliates by Bob Guinea from The Bachelor. Deval, a real estate investor, has spoken to many attendees at her real estate seminars and is currently ranked in the top 5% of agents in her brokerage. Join me in welcoming your host, Deval Morrison.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. Today I have with us Mark Weisleder. He is a great real estate lawyer, a speaker, an author, and a columnist. He's with the company realestatelawyers.ca. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Deval. It's a pleasure for me to be with you.
Awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about realestatelawyers.ca?
Yes. So we are a law firm with 30 offices across Ontario, and we have done deals everywhere in Ontario. And one of the nice things about our firm is that we come to your home to sign the papers. So everything is very simple. All of our fees and rates are on our website at realestatelawyers.ca. You can get a free quote, and it includes our coming to your home to sign the papers so you don't have to miss any work.
Awesome. That's great. That's amazing. Thanks so much, Mark. That's great. That's perfect.
My pleasure.
So tell us a little bit, what would you want, let's say, first-time home buyers to know? What's really important for them to know when making their first purchase?
Well, number one, they really should have the right real estate agent working with them. It's an incredibly difficult process to navigate, especially perhaps if they're an investor. You really want to have an agent working with you who is also an investor. I know that you, Deval, aren't an investor yourself. You know what it means to have positive cash flow and what to look for in a property. And that is really important for a first-time buyer, to work with an agent they can trust, because then they'll be guided to a mortgage broker to make sure they have enough money to afford their property, a lawyer to protect them when it comes to closing their deal, insurance people to make sure they have the proper insurance on a property. So you need to have the right team so that you go into this process as well prepared as possible.
Perfect. That sounds great. That makes a lot of sense. Is there anything that you think specifically first-time home buyers need to know about resale condos?
Resale condos, a few of the questions that you should ask is, number one, have units sold in the last 3 to 4 months in the building? If units have sold, there's a very good chance that 3 or 4 lawyers have already looked at the condominium documents and approved it. So that's a good sign that there's nothing going on that's negative in the condominium. Also look at the condominium number. There are about 2,500 condominiums in the GTA. So if you're number 2,400, it means your condominium is about 1 year old. If you're number 72, your condominium is 50 years old. So these are just a couple of tips to give you an idea how old the building is. You know, roofs need to be replaced every 25 years. And also, you want to ask who the property manager is. If it's one of the top property managers like Brookfield or First Service or Dell, you know that the board is getting good advice. So these are some of the tips to look for if you're buying a resale condo.
Perfect. That's great. And would you suggest that somebody purchase a condo without getting the status certificate first, or would that be something that's mandatory to you?
No, you have to. And it's usually not difficult. In some cases, if there's a bidding war, the seller will make the status certificate available. And I've reviewed many of these in advance for buyers so that they could make an offer without even a status certificate condition. Buyers should also make sure that they look at the parking space. You want to stand in the parking space, make sure that there's no equipment hanging from the ceiling, that you're not beside a big pillar where you'll dent your car 5 or 10 times. So it's very important that you check out everything, even in a resale condominium.
Perfect. And then can you just tell our listeners, if they've never heard of the word status certificate before, what's in a status certificate?
The status certificate contains let's call it disclosure. So you know everything that's going on in that property. So it will confirm if you own the parking space and locker that you're buying. It will confirm the monthly maintenance fee that the seller is paying. It will tell you whether you're paying extra for utilities. In a lot of condominiums, you will pay extra for hydro. So this will be in the status certificate. More important, it will tell you how much money is in the reserve fund. That's the fund that is gathered to pay for future repairs, and there will be a reserve fund study where engineers and accountants have looked at the reserve fund and have determined whether there is enough money to pay for future repairs. Because if there is not enough money, then the board may issue something called a special assessment, which is bad, because this means the owner has to come up with extra money because there isn't enough money in the reserve fund. So all of this information, whether there is enough money in the reserve fund, special assessment, or perhaps even a lawsuit involving the corporation, all of that will be included in the status certificate. So you have a very good picture as to whether this building is being run well as a first-class investment.
Great. That's awesome information, Mark. Now tell me a little bit about the special assessment. Let's say the special assessment, they haven't told people about it yet, but they know it's coming. Is it something that they would see 3 months out, 6 months out? How does that work?
Well, the status certificate will tell you whether or not, there's anything that has already been assessed. The agreement of purchase and sale says that if the seller hears about an upcoming special assessment, they have to disclose that to the buyer. One of the things I do whenever I look at a building is I call the property manager and I will ask them straight out, have there been any meetings where major repairs are being discussed? Could this lead to a special assessment in the next year? And so I'm usually able to find that out in my own review of the building, and buyers should ask those questions as well.
Perfect. That's great. So if you're a first-time buyer, we've kind of talked a little bit about resale condos. What about if they're purchasing a pre-construction condo? What would you think that first-time buyers need to know, or any buyer for that matter, of a pre-construction condo?
With a pre-construction condo, that's the only way you can buy real estate in Ontario with a buyer's remorse. You have 10 days to change your mind if it's a new condominium. So you'll have 10 days to go to a lawyer to make sure you understand it. And I review hundreds of these for first-time buyers. Some of the key things to know is that the purchase price is not everything that you're going to pay. There is a Schedule B, like boy, that contains a list of extra charges. These should be a maximum of 1 to 2% of the purchase price. If it's left open, like the subject of levies, which could be more, then you want the builder to give you some kind of a cap so you know the maximum of additional charges that you will have to pay. That's some of the main protection from a first-time buyer standpoint, is making sure you know exactly what you're going to pay when you close your deal.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I remember when I first bought my first pre-construction condo, it was probably 10 or 15 years or so ago, and I had the foresight to go and get a lawyer to take a look at my agreement. However, a couple of my neighbors never did that. And what I did notice is that when we all closed, my development charges were a lot lower than some of the other people because they never had a lawyer look at their agreement. So how do people know that this is really important to get a lawyer to take a look at their pre-construction documents?
Well, you know what? Hopefully the word gets out. You do have 10 days to change your mind. And the other thing I always tell my buyers is you have to check out other developments that the builder has completed. The contract in general is not fair. It allows the builder to extend the closing. They can change the finishings. They can even change the square footage.
Right.
And they could put a pillar in the room, and there's nothing you can do. So it's very important to go to a prior development that this builder has finished and speak to the owners and ask them, did they finish on time, number one? Did they deliver what they promised?
Right.
And then did they do all those repairs? Because they have a year to do all the repairs that you find in your pre-delivery inspection report. Mm-hmm. Did the builder do this, or did you have to fight the builder? So to me, that's the best research that a new buyer can do, and hopefully they go to a lawyer to look at the contract, during that 10-day period.
Gotcha. So then first-time home buyers, or any buyer really of a pre-construction condo, make sure they get a lawyer so that way they can get their development charges reduced a little bit. What happens to the HST upon closing?
Well, as long as the first-time buyer is moving into the property, there are no HST consequences. The HST is included in the price. Okay. The only time there will be consequences is if you want to rent your property and not move in, then you have to pay a little bit extra HST on closing, but then you apply for it back after closing from Canada Revenue Agency. It's a little bit more complicated. That's something I explain to buyers who are thinking of renting. I go through all the math with them.
Okay, got it. Now, what would you say about, let's say someone purchases a condo pre-construction and they decide before it closes that they want to sell it. So they want to sell it on assignment. What advice do you have for people who want to sell condos on assignment, or would you even recommend that?
Well, you know what? People's circumstances change. They may want to do this. Number one, you have to make sure your builder will allow it. Most builders will allow it, but only if you pay a fee. You won't be able to put the property back on MLS. You're going to have to find a private sort of buyer who is willing to take over your assignments. So it is possible. Some of the difficulties are though, that you will have to pay full income tax on any profit that you make. It's not going to be considered a capital gain. That's number one. And if you were not buying that unit initially to live in, then you could have to charge HST on that profit, which many sellers aren't even aware of. And then you could have a problem with the government if you are ever assessed on this. And so it's very important before you go to assign or thinking about it that you do speak to a lawyer so you understand all your legal and tax consequences so you make an informed decision if you decide to do it.
Got it. Okay. That definitely makes a lot of sense. Now, let's switch gears and talk about, for example, if you are a real estate investor and you're purchasing, let's say, a house, not a condo, anything that real estate investors should be cautious about if they're purchasing a house that already has tenants in there or doesn't have tenants in there, if they want to kick the tenants out?
Yeah, it's extremely hard to kick out a tenant because most of the time these are older properties and the tenant is paying below market rent. And in my experience, the only way that you can remove a tenant in that situation is you have to find them another place to live and pay their moving costs, sometimes even the difference in rent for a year. But that would be, in my opinion, worth it because then you could fix up the unit and rent it out for a lot more money. But otherwise, it's extremely hard. You can evict a tenant if you're planning on moving into a property, but you have to move in good faith and stay there at least a year. You can't trick a tenant where the fine is as high as $25,000. So that's not a good plan. Really, when you're investing, you have to make sure that the property is cash flow positive.
Yes.
In other words, the amount of rent coming in will pay all of your expenses. And this a good realtor can go through this with you. And again, your down payment is going to depend on that as well. How much can you borrow, and then will the property cash flow positive? But again, besides that, when it comes to tenants, you have to do your best to qualify tenants before you rent any space to them. You must check them out, because if you get a bad tenant, you're not getting income coming in, and it could take a long time to evict them because the eviction process is extremely slow in Ontario.
And what are some of the things that you would recommend for someone to check out a tenant before allowing them to move into their place?
Okay, a few things. Number one, you have to get references. I always speak to the prior landlord, not the current landlord, because the current landlord might be lying to get rid of them. So you want to speak to the landlord before the current landlord to get, a good reference about the tenant. That's number one. So besides calling all the references, of course, and where they work, some of the other tips, some people are worried about pets.
Right.
Some people interview the tenants where they live because then you could see how they treat someone's property and whether or not, for example, they do have a pet. We check the tenant out on Facebook. If the tenant has a pet, there'll be a picture of them with the pet on Facebook.
Of course there will be.
So you shouldn't be afraid. Yeah, you shouldn't be afraid to use social media to help you with that, with checking out tenants.
I was just going to ask you about when you're calling their references, what kinds of questions would you suggest that a prospective landlord or agent ask their references to check them out?
Well, if it's a landlord, of course, the main thing is you want to confirm the rent and the rent that was paid in a timely manner. You may also want to ask if they got along with the other tenants. Or whether they, caused any issues with the other tenants. And those are perfectly okay questions to ask, but it's mostly around the ability to pay, that they paid the rent and they pay on time. That is, one of the key things to know. One of my favorite questions to ask a tenant is, tell me about yourself.
Okay.
Because then the tenant may volunteer more. Then you can find out in a just straight yes-no question type answer format. So that's a really good question to ask tenants is just tell me about yourself. And then you might find out about pets and all kinds of other things, that you may not know later. I once had an investor who called me up screaming after reading one of my articles. She said, I checked out my tenants on Facebook and they had a picture of them with a pig. A real pig.
Oh,
she asked me if there was a pig in the house, and I said maybe. Turned out there was a pig in the house. The property was in Hamilton, and the Hamilton bylaw actually allows a certain pig that's licensed to be a pet. This
Oh my God.
tenant had a licensed pet, and there was nothing that this woman could do